This video is sponsored by the Magnet Baron. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of Ridiculous Rules. We've talked a lot about World Eaters in the last week or so, and so I wanted to talk about one of their core mechanics, the Surge move. Now, first of all, let's talk about exactly what is a Surge move. According to the rules commentary, a Surge move is explicitly a non-normal move that is triggered out of phase by some kind of criteria. Thanks to the Eldari FAQ, triggered normal moves that move out of phase don't count as surge moves, despite meeting all of the other criteria. This usually encompasses reactive moves, so you'll have an ability, for example, that says you can make a normal move of up to d6 inches after an enemy ends a movement within 9 inches of you. That is explicitly not a surge move, so it doesn't follow any of these rules. Surge moves are typically triggered when enemies attack you and allow you to move towards them. This awkwardly does mean that effects like Insanity's Ire from the Annihilation Legion detachment in Necrons, despite looking exactly like a surge move, an effect that triggers a move in response to being attacked by an enemy, is not a surge move because it makes you make a normal move, which, as we just talked about, thanks to Eldar, is not a surge move. So when you have one of these moves, which is essentially a nondescript type of movement, these are considered surge moves and they're governed by some baseline criteria, thanks to the rules commentary. A unit may only make one surge move per phase, so even if you have an ability that would theoretically trigger in response to every enemy attacking you, as long as that triggered effect is a surge move, you can only get one of them during that opposing shooting phase. You cannot make them while you are battle shocked, and you also cannot do so while you are engaged. So even if it's a special type of movement that doesn't say you can't perform it while engaged, the rules commentary have superseded that and say you cannot do this while you're engaged with an enemy. This was the case for surge moves like Go Get 'em from Orcs, which allowed you to move in response to being shot at, and it didn't say it couldn't move while within engagement range, so you could actually reposition your unit while engaged by enemies, which was pretty wild. However, that obviously has been changed. You can no longer use that stratagem while you're engaged with an enemy. Now, the most common type of surge moves are called blood surge moves, and that is what we are going to be discussing today. They're called blood surge moves because the blood surge is the name of the ability on the Khorne Berserker datasheet, and these are kind of like the poster children of this mechanic. Khorne Berserkers are the thing that everyone immediately thinks about when they consider surge moves. Now, blood surge moves, as I discussed previously, are a surge move that moves you towards the closest enemy in response to enemies attacking you. Now, there's some nuance between different units that have these types of surge moves because, unfortunately for us, they're not templated, so every unit has a worded slightly different version, but I'm going to be discussing the rules that govern all of these movement types. Essentially, they all follow the same criteria. Your unit is attacked by an enemy and takes wounds, is hit, or loses models as a result of those attacks. The surge gets triggered, and then you can determine a distance your unit is allowed to move. That move must be resolved so that it gets you as close as possible to the closest enemy unit to the unit performing the surge move. Oftentimes, you will also be allowed to engage the closest enemy. So you look at your unit on the battlefield, you determine the closest enemy unit to it, move as far as you can towards that unit, and you can engage them if you want to. This video is brought to you by the Magnet Baron. Magnet Baron is your one-stop shop for all of your miniature magnetization needs. If you are looking to get into some of the new big stompy factions that have just released, Magnet Baron wants me to talk to you about their new no-drill magnet kits. These are kits that apply alongside large miniatures like Imperial Knight and give you replacement parts as well as magnets that allow you to utilize the entire kit, adding specialized attachments and joints that allow you to add magnets into the construction of the model, allowing you to easily swap your weapons on and off. With how fast the metagame of 10th edition Warhammer 40k changes, having flexible weapon options on your models just makes sense, and especially for these expensive vehicle and Titan kits that have a wide variety of options available to them, magnets are the way to go. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com. Links are in the video description. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Let's hop in Tabletop Simulator for a moment to explain exactly how this resolves. So let's say, for example, we have a Blade Guard veteran unit over here, as well as an Intercessor squad. The Intercessor squad has attacked the Khorne Berserkers, and as a result, one or more of the Khorne Berserkers has been destroyed. The Surge move then triggers, and the Khorne Berserkers determine the closest enemy unit to them. A little idiosyncratically, this doesn't allow you necessarily to move towards the unit that attacked you. It moves you as close as possible to the closest enemy unit. So in this case, we can see that we're 5.8 inches away from the Intercessors here. However, it looks like we are closer to the Blade Guard veterans. The way that the distance between units is calculated in 40k is the closest point of the bases or hulls, if they use that, of the two closest models in those two units. So for example, in this case, this Khorne Berserker in the front is the closest model to the Blade Guard veterans. The distance between those units is considered to be 3.6 inches because that's the distance between those two models' bases. This means that the Blade Guard veterans are going to be the closest unit to the Khorne Berserkers. They're going to then roll a d6 to determine the distance that they can perform their Surge move. They get plus 2 inches to their Surge move dice, so in this case 3 plus the 2 inches for their ability would be 5 inches. They can then perform a move of 5 inches. Now, here's the weird thing about this. The only requirement of that move is that it can only engage this unit, if you have the opportunity to do so, and that move must bring the Khorne Berserker unit as close as possible to the Blade Guard veteran unit. The closest that this Khorne Berserker unit can possibly go. Essentially, the shortest distance between these two models must be as small as it possibly can. That's the requirement to complete the Surge move. So in this case, this guy would move base to base. Now, exactly where he goes base to base doesn't really matter, as long as he moves no more than 5 inches. Whether he's basing here or whether he's basing here doesn't make a difference. You're still as close as you possibly can be to the unit that you are directed to move towards. So in this case, we'll go ahead and move this guy here to get ourselves as much movement as possible. That completes the requirement of the Surge move. It has moved as close as it possibly can to the closest enemy unit. From there, the rest of the models in the surging unit are unrestricted in their movement, with the caveat that they cannot engage units that are not this Blade Guard veteran squad. So essentially, we determined the closest unit. That unit becomes unlocked for engagement, and the closest model in the surging unit must move directly towards it in an attempt to get base to base, essentially. Once that's done, this is essentially treated like a normal move. The rest of your unit can potentially do things like move this way. It doesn't matter that they're not getting closer to the Blade Guard veterans, because the requirement that the unit moves as close to the Blade Guard veterans as it can has already been satisfied. So these guys could potentially go over here, and if not charged, they will fight and potentially pile in and attack these intercessors. That's why Surge moves are such a weird mechanic, because it sounds like it would be something that moves your unit directly towards the enemy unit, and everyone in your unit essentially charges them, but that's not actually how it works. If multiple models in your unit are in a position where they can end that Blood Surge movement in the closest legal position to the closest enemy, in some cases, if you have a Surge movement that doesn't allow you to move into engagement range of enemies, for example, you could move to just be outside of 1 inch of those guys, basically like 1.0001 away. Or if you're able to engage that unit, the closest possible point would be base to base. That criteria could be fulfilled by multiple berserkers. So I want to clarify here that the only time that the as close as possible criterion has to be fulfilled by the closest model in the blood surging unit is when you are far enough away that you won't be able to make it to that closest possible legal position, in which case, by definition, the only way to get as close as possible is for this model in the front, the model closest to the closest enemy unit, to move their maximum distance. If we could base with multiple Khorne Berserkers, however, for example, we could, despite the fact this guy being the closest, we could elect to use this guy to satisfy the closest possible criteria. Now, a similar weird thing can happen if you are between two units. Let's say, for example, that the Khorne Berserkers have lost a model and they've triggered their Blood Surge move in response to something shooting them. It could be anything in the game. It doesn't actually matter what has attacked them as long as it's an enemy and it's during their shooting phase. In this case, we're going to take a peek at the distance between all enemy units. So it looks like we're 3 inches away from these intercessors and about 2.5 inches away from these Blade Guard veterans. Just like we looked at previously, that means that the closest enemy unit to us is going to be the Blade Guard veterans. And the closest model to those Blade Guard veterans is this guy right here. He, as we talked about before, is going to make his Blood Surge move and has to get base contact with that enemy unit. From there, these guys do not have to move towards these intercessors. This feels like it should be a combat movement where each individual model is required to move towards the closest enemy. That's not the case. These guys, if they wanted to, could elect to move in this direction if they so desired. The requirement that moved as close as possible to the closest enemy unit has already been satisfied. The rest of the Khorne Berserkers can follow him, or, as we talked about previously, move up to just outside an inch of the intercessor squad if they want, as long as they maintain coherency with the other members of their unit. In this way, a Blood Surge move can be kind of treated like a charge move. However, the movement is much freer than you get out of a charge move, since only one model will have to move into base contact or engagement range if you're able to do that. Now, it's also worth mentioning that the distance that each model moves is determined on a per model basis. As long as the closest model from the surging unit moves as far as it can towards them to try to shorten the distance by as much as possible, then the rest of the unit can choose the distance that they move up to the number that you rolled. So, for example, if we rolled a 7-inch Blood Surge move and we have already completed the requirement of the closest model moving 7 inches towards the closest enemy, the rest of the unit could choose to move 0 and just stand where they are if they want to, as long as they can maintain coherency with the model that did make that movement. In addition, there is also a rules commentary entry that allows units to forego their Blood Surge move after rolling the distance that they move. In these cases, you roll the distance, and if it's not a move that you want to make, then you can just choose not to move. It's an optional movement. However, the commentary has specified that this counts as performing a 0-inch Blood Surge move, which prevents you from performing future Blood Surge moves later on in the round. So, for example, if your Blood Surge move would bring your unit out of cover and would bring them into a disadvantageous position where they're going to get shot by more units and charged, you can roll the dice and see if you get something you want, maybe to engage an enemy and prevent things from shooting. If you don't get it, you can simply stay there and remain in cover or remain in out of threat range of your opponents. You just can't trigger a Blood Surge move again if you choose to do so. Now, there is also another FAQ in the rules commentary that dictates what happens when this move gets triggered as a result of Overwatch. So in some cases, you may have a Blood Surge move that is not locked to the shooting phase or to a particular phase. If that happens, you could have out of activation shooting that can trigger a Blood Surge move. We have an example here of Carnifexes. I've decided to play Tyranids today, and for some reason I've decided to take a Carnifex brood. Carnifexes have an ability called Blistering Assault, which is a surge move that does not require it to be the attacking unit's shooting phase. In this case, it triggers anytime a unit is selected to shoot, and as a result of those attacks, deal 1 or more damage to the Carnifex unit. So, for example, during the Tyranid player's turn, we could select our Carnifex brood to move, and as a response, these Ultramarine Intercessors could be selected to Overwatch. In this case, Overwatch is considered to be a selection to shoot if they shoot at the Carnifexes with their Overwatch attacks, and that results in the Carnifexes taking 1 or more damage, Blistering Assault will trigger. Now, according to the rules commentary, if this occurs as the result of a movement, and the resulting Blood Surge then moves the Carnifexes into engagement range of an enemy unit, the Carnifexes cannot then continue their original movement. That movement fizzles and is essentially replaced by the Blood Surge. However, if their roll for the Blood Surge roll was not sufficient enough to get them into engagement range, they just absolutely rolled like trash on their Surge movement, then they can still complete the original movement. So if that Blood Surge was triggered at the start of their movement and they haven't yet performed their normal move, they can then continue to perform that move after Blood Surging, essentially gaining additional movement thanks to that ability. Now, playing devil's advocate here and talking about all of the interactions, unfortunately, Blood Surge is not the most well-written rule, and subsequent FAQs have added a lot of ambiguity. There is an argument to be made because of how the rules commentary is worded that the closest model to the closest enemy unit in the Blood Surging unit can choose to move less than what would get them into engagement range if they want to. I don't believe this is the intended interpretation, but I thought it would mention it because I do know that sometimes it does get ruled this way. Essentially, in those cases, you would roll the dice to determine your blood surge distance and then choose to move a movement smaller than that. So if I rolled a 6, I could choose to move 4 inches, and then I would move as close as possible to the closest enemy up to that 4 inches. As I mentioned before, I don't think this is the intended interpretation. There's just been some muddying of the waters that's been done by all of the FAQs that Games Workshop has made to this mechanic. This is a kind of unnecessarily complicated mechanic, and unfortunately one that Games Workshop hasn't really found a way to do justice yet. But with that, those are all the mechanics for Blood Surge in Warhammer 40k. So I hope that this elucidated how this mechanic actually works, as well as some of the weird idiosyncrasies around these rules. Let me know down in the comment section if you have any other rules that you'd like me to talk about on this series. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you for watching all the way to the end of the video. And thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, people who support me via YouTube channel membership or via Twitch subscription. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.